Climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and tackling it requires significant financial resources. Climate finance is the funding provided for projects and activities aimed at mitigating or adapting to the effects of climate change. This can include funding for renewable energy projects, research and development of new technologies, and programs to assist communities and countries in adapting to the impacts of climate change. The sources of climate change finance can include government funding, private investment, and international aid. In this video, we will explore the role of global climate funds and other organizations in shaping the landscape of climate finance and their impact on addressing the climate change crisis. The Global Climate Fund, GCF, is one of the most important players in the world of climate finance. The GCF is a multilateral fund established to assist developing countries in their efforts to combat climate change. The fund was created in 2010 as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and has since become a key source of financing for climate-related projects in developing countries. The GCF provides funding for a wide range of activities, including renewable energy projects, sustainable transportation, and programs to help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. One of the key objectives of the GCF is to mobilize funding from developed countries to assist developing countries in their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. To date, the GCF has mobilized over $10 billion in funding from developed countries, which has been used to support over 500 projects in over 100 developing countries. These projects have helped to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, promote sustainable development, and improve the resilience of communities to the impacts of climate change. Another important organization in the world of climate finance is the Global Environment Facility, GEF. The GEF is a partnership of 183 countries, international institutions, and civil society organizations that provides funding for projects that address global environmental problems, including climate change. The GEF was established in 1991 and has since provided over $18 billion in funding for projects in over 170 countries. The GEF focuses on funding projects that promote sustainable development, biodiversity conservation, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The GEF has also played a key role in helping to mobilize additional funding for climate-related projects. For example, the GEF has leveraged its funding to mobilize an additional more funding from other sources, including the private sector, for climate-related projects. This has helped to significantly increase the impact of the GEF's funding and has played a key role in addressing the climate change crisis. In addition to the GCF and the GEF, there are a number of other organizations that play a significant role in shaping the climate finance landscape. These include the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. The IMF, for example, provides policy advice and financial assistance to countries to help them address the impacts of climate change, while the World Bank provides funding for projects that promote sustainable development and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The African Development Bank, similarly, focuses on providing funding for projects that promote sustainable development and address the impacts of climate change in Africa. All of these organizations have played a vital role in shaping the climate finance landscape and have helped to provide much-needed funding for climate-related projects. However, despite the important role that these organizations have played, there is still a significant funding gap that needs to be filled in order to effectively address the climate change crisis. According to estimates, the world needs to invest around $1 trillion per year in order to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, the goal agreed upon by the Paris Agreement. One of the key ways to fill this funding gap is through increased public funding. Governments around the world have a critical role to play in providing funding for climate-related projects, particularly in developing countries where the need for funding is greatest. This can include funding for renewable energy projects, research and development of new technologies, and programs to assist communities and countries in adapting to the impacts of climate change. Another important source of funding is through the private sector. Private sector investment in climate-related projects can provide a significant source of funding, particularly for projects that have the potential to generate a return on investment. This can include investments in renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects, and other projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, carbon pricing mechanisms such as carbon taxes and cap-and-trade systems can also provide a significant source of funding for climate-related projects. These mechanisms put a price on carbon emissions and can generate significant revenue that can be used to fund climate-related projects. International aid is also an important source of funding for climate-related projects in developing countries. Many developed countries have committed to providing financial assistance to developing countries to help them address the impacts of climate change. This can include funding for renewable energy projects, research and development of new technologies, and programs to assist communities and countries in adapting to the impacts of climate change. In conclusion, climate finance is a crucial aspect of efforts to combat climate change and its impacts. The role of global climate funds and other organizations such as the GCF, GEF, IMF, World Bank, and African Development Bank are shaping the landscape of climate finance, providing funding for a wide range of activities that help to mitigate and adapt to climate change. However, despite the important role that these organizations have played, there is still a significant funding gap that needs to be filled in order to effectively address the climate change crisis. In order to fill this funding gap, it is essential that we continue to explore new sources of climate finance, including increased public funding, private sector investment, carbon pricing mechanisms, and international aid.